The morning I walked into the boardroom of Meridian Industries as their newly appointed chief financial officer, I felt like I was stepping into a dream I'd been chasing for 15 years. My reflection stared back at me from the polished mahogany table. A woman who had clawed her way up from nothing, wearing a power suit that cost more than I used to make in 3 months. The corner office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Silverton, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged in a room this prestigious. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was 32 years old, and I had just become the youngest CFO in the company's history. The salary package was more money than my entire family had ever seen combined. Stock options, executive benefits, a company car, everything I'd dreamed about during those brutal years when I was surviving on ramen noodles and 3 hours of sleep. But as I sat in that leather chair, adjusting the nameplate that read Scarlett Ravencroft, Chief Financial Officer, my phone buzzed with a text message that made my stomach drop to the floor. It was from my brother, Nathaniel. "Hey, Scar, congrats on the big promotion," Mom told me. "Listen, I'm in a bit of a financial bind right now and could really use your help. Think we could talk soon? You know, family helps family, right?" I stared at that message for a full minute, my hands trembling slightly as memories came, flooding back like a dam had burst in my mind. The audacity, the absolute, breathtaking audacity of this man to ask me for money after everything our family had put me through. You see, while Nathaniel was living it up at Harvard University, tuition, room, board, spending money, spring, break trips to Cabo, all paid for by our parents, I was working 3 jobs just to afford community college textbooks. While he was joining exclusive fraternities and networking with future CEOs at expensive Boston restaurants, I was serving coffee at Brewster's Cafe at 5 a.m., filing papers at Morrison Legal Associates until 3 p.m., and cleaning office buildings in downtown Millbrook until midnight. Our parents, Richard and Helena Ravencroft, had made it crystal clear from the beginning. Nathaniel was their investment in the future. He was 2 years older, naturally gifted at everything, charming, athletic, and according to them, destined for greatness. I was the backup plan. The daughter who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and resources were left over, after ensuring their golden boy had everything he needed to succeed. When Nathaniel got accepted to Harvard with average grades, thanks to Dad's alumni connections and a hefty donation to the university, they didn't hesitate to write a check for $68,000 a year. When I graduated high school as valedictorian with a full scholarship offer to Whitmore State University, they said I should stay local and go to Riverdale Community College instead because it's more practical for a girl. The scholarship was for 4 years, full ride, to study business and economics. It was my ticket out, my chance to prove I was worth investing in. But Dad sat me down in his study, surrounded by photos of Nathaniel's achievements, and explained that they needed me to stay close to home. Someone had to help Mom with the house, take care of Grandma Evelyn when she got sick, and be responsible. Nathaniel needed to focus on his studies without distractions. "You're strong, Scarlett," Dad had said, not meeting my eyes. "You'll figure out a way to make it work. You always do. Nathaniel needs this opportunity more than you do." So while my brother was pledging Sigma Chi and studying international business in historic lecture halls, I was fighting for every single credit hour. At Riverdale Community College, I worked 25 hours a week at Brewster's Cafe, making coffee for commuters who barely acknowledged my existence. I worked another 20 hours filing legal documents at Morrison Legal Associates, where attorney Marcus Caldwell paid me $8 an hour to organize case files and answer phones. And 3 nights a week, I cleaned offices at the Grandview Business Complex from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., emptying trash cans and scrubbing toilets left behind by executives who made more in a day than I made in a month. My days started at 4:30 a.m. and ended at 3 a.m. I studied in my car between jobs, in break rooms under fluorescent lights, and at my tiny kitchen table while eating 79-cent microwave dinners. I had exactly one pair of jeans, 3 work shirts, and shoes that were held. Together with duct tape, I hadn't bought anything new for myself in 2 years. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's Instagram was full of photos from Boston Harbor, expensive dinners in the North End, ski trips to Vermont, and internships at prestigious firms that our father had arranged through his business connections. Every Christmas, he'd come home with stories about professors who were former CEOs, networking events at 5-star hotels, and job opportunities that were practically guaranteed after graduation. And our parents ate it up. Every story was proof that their investment was paying off. Every opportunity he landed was validation that they had made the right choice in prioritizing his future over mine. But here's what they didn't know. Every rejection, every sleepless night, every moment I felt invisible and worthless was building something inside me that Nathaniel would never have. It was building an unbreakable determination to prove that their golden boy wasn't the only Ravencroft capable of greatness. As I sat in that corner office, looking at my brother's text message asking for my financial help, I realized this was the moment I had been unknowingly preparing for my entire adult life. The moment when everything would come full circle, and the family that had written me off as practical and responsible would finally see exactly what their abandoned daughter had become. This wasn't just about money. This was about 15 years of being told I wasn't worth the investment. This was about watching my brother get handed everything while I fought for scraps. This was about parents who measured love in dollar signs and decided I didn't deserve their financial support because I wasn't born with the right anatomy and the right level of charm. But most of all, this was about a woman who had spent half her life proving she was worth more than anyone in her family ever believed. And now, had the power to decide whether the golden boy who never had to struggle for anything deserved her help. The irony was delicious, terrifying, and absolutely perfect. Welcome to the story of how I went from being the forgotten daughter to holding my family's financial future in my hands, and what I decided to do with that power. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Westbridge Hills, I was always the responsible one in the Ravencroft family. While my brother Nathaniel was celebrated for being the charming social butterfly who could talk his way out of any situation, I was the daughter who quietly got straight A's, handled household emergencies, and never caused any drama that might embarrass our parents at the country club. From as early as I can remember, our roles were clearly defined. Nathaniel was the future CEO, the one who would carry on the family legacy and make our parents proud at their weekly bridge games with the Ashworths and the Pemberton family. I was the dependable backup plan, smart enough to take care of myself, but not ambitious enough to require the same level of investment or attention. The pattern was so consistent it became the background music of my childhood. When Nathaniel brought home a C+ on his report card, Dad would pat him on the back and say, "That's okay, son. You're a people person. Grades aren't everything." When I brought home my 3rd consecutive semester of perfect grades, Mom would glance at it and say, "That's nice, sweetheart. Can you help me with dinner? Your brother has basketball practice." Nathaniel played varsity basketball, starred in the school plays, and was homecoming king junior year. He had this effortless confidence that made everyone gravitate toward him. Teachers, classmates, even our elderly neighbor Mrs. Holloway, who usually complained about teenagers. Our parents saw this natural charisma as proof that he was destined for leadership roles, big corner offices, and the kind of success that would make them proud to display his achievements on their mantelpiece. E, on the other hand, was the girl, who spent Friday nights in the Millbrook Public Library, volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends, and maintaining the highest GPA in my graduating class. I was quiet, studious, and what my mother politely called internally motivated. Translation: I didn't need external validation or financial support because I was self-sufficient. I was the daughter who would figure things out on her own, who didn't require the same level of parental guidance and investment that Nathaniel needed to reach his full potential. The difference in how they saw our futures became crystal clear during family dinner conversations. When discussing Nathaniel's plans, the talk centered around which Ivy League school would be the best fit, which connections Dad could leverage through his position at Blackstone and Associates Financial Group, and how much money they'd need to set aside for tuition, housing, and networking opportunities. When the conversation turned to my future, it was always framed around practicality and limitations. "Scarlett is so smart, she could do well at any local college," Mom would say to her sister during their weekly phone calls. "She's not like Nathaniel. She doesn't need all the bells and whistles. She's happy with simple things." The truth was, I had dreams that were just as big as my brother's. I wanted to study international business, maybe get my MBA from somewhere prestigious, travel the world working for multinational corporations. I dreamed of boardrooms and power suits and making decisions that affected thousands of people. But whenever I tried to voice these ambitions, I was met with gentle redirection. "That's wonderful that you're thinking big, honey," Dad would say. "But you have to be realistic about what's practical for someone in your position, my position." As if being born female had automatically placed me in a different category of human being, one with smaller dreams and more modest requirements for happiness. While Nathaniel's bedroom walls were covered with posters of successful business moguls and motivational quotes about reaching for the stars, my achievements were acknowledged with a quiet nod and an immediate transition to discussing what needed to be done around the house. When he won the Most Likely to Succeed award senior year, our parents threw him a celebration dinner at Romano's, the most expensive restaurant in town. When I was named valedictorian, Mom bought a grocery store cake and we ate it while watching. To me, the pattern was so deeply ingrained that I almost didn't notice it anymore. It had become the normal rhythm of our family life. Nathaniel was the sun around which everything orbited, and I was the dependable moon, always present, always helpful, but never quite bright enough to command the same level of attention and investment. Even our extended family had bought into this narrative. During holiday gatherings at Grandmother Adelaide's estate in Brookhaven, the aunts and uncles would fuss over Nathaniel's latest accomplishments while asking me about my grades in the same tone they might ask about the weather, polite, but not particularly interested in the answer. Uncle Marcus would always joke, "Nathaniel's going to be running a Fortune 500 company someday, and Scarlett will probably end up being his very capable assistant." Everyone would laugh, including my parents, as if this was not only acceptable but exactly how things should be. I learned early that my role was to be proud of my brother's success, supportive of his dreams, and understanding when family resources were directed toward his future rather than mine. I was supposed to be grateful for whatever opportunities were left over after ensuring that Nathaniel had everything he needed to fulfill his potential. And for the first 18 years of my life, I played that role perfectly. I was the good daughter who didn't ask for too much, who solved her own problems, and who celebrated other people's victories without expecting the same level of celebration for her own achievements. But what my family didn't realize was that every time they chose to invest in Nathaniel's future instead of mine, they were teaching me something valuable. That if I wanted something, I was going to have to fight for it myself. And fighting for yourself, I would later discover, builds muscles that having everything handed to you never could. The first time I truly understood that my achievements would never matter as much as Nathaniel's was during my sophomore year of high school. I had just won the regional economics competition, beating out students from 12 different schools, including the prestigious Whitmore Academy. The prize was a $5,000 scholarship and a guaranteed internship at Sterling Financial, one of the most respected investment firms in the tri-state area. I was 16 years old and had just accomplished something that most college students could only dream of. I remember running home from school, my heart pounding with excitement, clutching the certificate and scholarship letter in my sweaty hands. I burst through the front door of our colonial house on Elmwood Drive, practically vibrating, with joy. "Mom! Dad! I won! I won the regional economics competition!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the marble foyer. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, looking mildly annoyed by the disruption. "That's wonderful, honey," she said in the same tone she might use to acknowledge that I'd remembered to take out the trash. "But keep your voice down. Your father is on an important call with the Henderson account." I stood there, holding my life-changing achievement, waiting for some recognition of what this meant. This wasn't just a good grade or a small award. This was major. This was proof that I had business acumen, that I could compete with and beat students who had every advantage I didn't. "Mom, it comes with a $5,000 scholarship," I said, trying to contain my excitement, but still hoping she'd understand the magnitude of what had just happened. She nodded absently while checking something on her phone. "That's nice, sweetheart. Maybe you can use it for community college textbooks. Speaking of which, can you pick up your brother from basketball practice? I promised Mrs. Ashworth I'd help her with the charity gala planning, and I'm already running late." The deflation was immediate and crushing. My moment of triumph had lasted exactly 47 seconds before being reduced to transportation logistics for Nathaniel. But the real blow came that evening at dinner. Dad had finally finished his important call, and we were sitting around our mahogany dining table eating Mom's famous rosemary chicken. I brought up my win again, hoping that with Dad's full attention, the significance might finally register. "That's great, kiddo," he said, cutting his chicken without looking up. "Very proud of you for trying your best." Trying my best. As if I had participated in some local hobby competition rather than defeating the top economics students in the I region. Then Nathaniel spoke up. "Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. Coach Martinez said there's a good chance I might make varsity next year if I keep improving my free throw percentage." The energy in the room shifted immediately. Mom set down her fork. Dad looked up from his plate, and suddenly everyone was fully engaged. "That's incredible, son," Dad beamed. "Varsity as a junior? That's exactly the kind of leadership experience that will look fantastic on college applications." "We should call your Uncle Robert," Mom added excitedly. "He played varsity at Harvard. He might have some advice about how to leverage athletic achievements for Ivy League admissions." For the next 30 minutes, the entire conversation centered around Nathaniel's hypothetical varsity basketball career and its potential impact on his college prospects. My regional economics competition victory, with its actual scholarship and internship opportunities, was never mentioned again. That pattern would repeat itself countless times over the next 2 years, but 3 incidents stood out as particularly crushing examples of how differently our achievements were valued. Junior year, I won the state academic decathlon, leading our team to victory against 47 other schools. It was a grueling competition that required mastery of 10 different subjects, from literature to mathematics to science. I had spent 8 months preparing, studying until 2 a.m. most nights, sacrificing my social life entirely. When we won, it was the first time Millbrook High School had ever placed first in the state competition. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story on our team, with a focus on me as the captain who had scored the highest individual points in the competition's history. It should have been a moment of pure celebration, a recognition that would look incredible on college applications and might even lead to additional scholarship opportunities. But that same week, Nathaniel scored 23 points in a basketball game against our school's biggest rival, Clearwater High. It was a great game, and I was genuinely proud of my brother's performance. But when the newspaper called our house to schedule the interview about my academic decathlon victory, Dad told them it wasn't a good time because the family was focusing on supporting Nathaniel during playoff season. The interview never happened. The story was never written. My historic achievement became a footnote while Nathaniel's basketball statistics were discussed at length during every family gathering for the next 6 months. Senior year brought the most devastating example of this double standard. I had been working with Mrs. Chen, my AP economics teacher, to develop a business plan for a small investment consulting firm that would serve middle-class families who couldn't afford traditional wealth management services. It was innovative, thoroughly researched, and addressed a real gap in the market. When I submitted this business plan to the Young Entrepreneurs of America competition, it won first place nationally. The prize was a $25,000 scholarship to any accredited business school and a mentorship opportunity with Margaret Thornfield, one of the most successful female entrepreneurs in the country. I was 18 years old and had just created something that industry professionals considered worthy of national recognition. The scholarship alone was enough to cover my first year at a decent business school, and the mentorship could have opened doors I'd never even dreamed of walking through. When I told my parents about winning, Dad's first response was, "That's wonderful, honey. Have you thought about how you're going to manage this with your responsibilities at home?" My responsibilities at home, as if my national achievement was secondary to my role as the family's built-in caretaker and household manager. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused by his response. "Well," Mom chimed in, "this mentorship thing sounds like it might require travel or time commitments that could interfere with your plan to stay local for college. And with Nathaniel going away to school, we'll need you around more than ever to help manage things here." I stared at them, feeling like I was speaking a foreign language. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," I said slowly. "Margaret Thornfield has mentored 3 women who went on to become Fortune 500 CEOs. Dad nodded sympathetically. "I understand you're excited, Scarlett. But we have to think practically about what's realistic for your situation. Nathaniel is going to need all our financial support for Harvard. This mentorship sounds nice, but it's not as concrete as a guaranteed education." That conversation happened on a Tuesday. On Thursday of the same week, Nathaniel casually mentioned that he'd been accepted to Harvard with a below-average SAT score and a GPA that wouldn't have qualified him for community college without Dad's alumni connection and the $50 donation our parents had made to the university's athletics program. The celebration was immediate and extravagant. Mom called every relative we had. Dad opened a bottle of champagne that he'd been saving for special occasions. They planned a party, ordered custom announcements, and began discussing which luxury items Nathaniel would need for his dorm room. My national business competition victory was never mentioned during the celebration. The mentorship opportunity that could have changed my life was dismissed as unrealistic. But Nathaniel's acceptance to a school that our parents had essentially purchased for him was treated like the greatest achievement in family history. That night, lying in my bed listening to my parents on the phone with relatives, bragging about their Harvard son, I finally understood that no achievement would ever be big enough to change how they saw me. I could cure cancer, win a Nobel Prize, or become president, and it would still be overshadowed by whatever ordinary thing Nathaniel accomplished that week. But instead of breaking me, that realization did something unexpected. It freed me. If I was never going to get their approval or support anyway, then I might as well pursue exactly what I wanted without worrying about their opinions or expectations. That was the night I decided that Margaret Thornfield's mentorship wasn't just an opportunity. It was my escape route from a family that would never see my worth. The moment that shattered my illusions completely came 3 weeks before high school graduation. I was sitting in the guidance counselor's office with Mrs. Patterson, finalizing my decision about Margaret Thornfield's mentorship program and discussing my options for business school. The mentorship required a commitment to spend the summer in Chicago working directly with Margaret's consulting firm, followed by quarterly meetings throughout my freshman year of college. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that could catapult someone from a middle-class background into the upper echelons of the business world. Margaret had specifically chosen me because, in her words, I had demonstrated exceptional strategic thinking and an innovative approach to solving real-world economic problems. She saw potential in me that my own family had never acknowledged. Mrs. Patterson was excited about the opportunity and had been helping me navigate the logistics. "Scarlett, this is unprecedented," she told me, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "In 23 years of counseling students, I've never seen anything like this. Margaret Thornfield doesn't take on mentees lightly. She's only worked with 12 young people in her entire career, and all of them are now running major corporations or have started their own successful companies." We had been discussing housing options in Chicago and how to coordinate the mentorship with my college applications when my phone rang. It was my mother, and her voice had that particular tone that meant she needed me to handle something immediately. "Scarlett, honey, I need you to come home right now. There's been a situation with your brother's Harvard preparations, and we need to have a family meeting." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of situation?" "Just come home. We'll explain everything when you get here." I drove back to our house on Elmwood Drive with a growing sense of dread. The last time we'd had an emergency family meeting was when Grandpa Theodore had been diagnosed with cancer. What could possibly be wrong with Nathaniel's Harvard preparations? Classes didn't even start for 3 months. When I walked into our living room, I found my parents sitting on the cream-colored sofa with expressions I'd never seen before. Dad looked genuinely distressed, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. Mom was clutching a tissue and had clearly been crying. Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen. "Sit down, sweetheart," Mom said, patting the armchair across from them. "We need to talk about some changes to the family's financial situation." I sat down slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. Had Dad lost his job? Were we going to lose the house? Had something happened to our investments? Dad cleared his throat and looked directly at me. "Scarlett, we've just discovered that Nathaniel's expenses at Harvard are going to be significantly higher than we originally calculated." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean? Tuition is $68,000 a year. You've been planning for that since he was in middle school." "It's not just tuition," Mom said, her voice strained. "It's everything else. The housing, the meal plans, the textbooks, the networking activities, the spring break trips, the summer programs. And then there are the unexpected costs we didn't plan for." Dad leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Son, your brother made some poor financial decisions during his senior year. He ran up significant credit card debt buying things for his girlfriend, taking expensive trips with his friends, purchasing a car we told him he couldn't afford. We just discovered he owes nearly $30,000. The room went silent. I stared at my parents, processing what they were telling me. Nathaniel had racked up $30,000 in debt buying luxury items and experiences, and somehow this had become a family financial crisis. "Okay," I said slowly. "So what does this have to do with me?" Mom and Dad exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. "Well," Mom began carefully, "we've been thinking about your summer plans, and we realized that this mentorship program in Chicago is going to be expensive. Housing costs, transportation, living expenses, and since you'll be working full-time, for the mentorship, you won't be able to earn money to help offset Nathaniel's additional costs." I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Dad nodded gravely. "We think it would be better for the family if you stayed local this summer. You could get a full-time job here in Millbrook, live at home to save money and contribute to helping us manage Nathaniel's financial situation. Family comes first, and right now, your brother needs our support more than ever." The words hit me like a physical blow. They were asking me to give up a once-in-a-lifetime mentorship opportunity with one of the most successful businesswomen in the country so that I could work minimum-wage jobs to pay for my brother's credit card debt. Debt he had accumulated buying, things he knew he couldn't afford. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, my voice eerily calm. Nathaniel spent $30,000 on unnecessary purchases, knowing he was going to Harvard and knowing you were already stretching financially to support him. And your solution is for me to give up Margaret Thornfield's mentorship, something I earned through my own achievements, to work low-paying jobs and help bail him out. Don't think of it as giving up the mentorship, Mom said quickly. Think of it as postponing it. Maybe you can contact Ms. Thornfield and ask if you can defer for a year. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Margaret Thornfield doesn't defer mentorships, Mom. She has a waiting list of hundreds of qualified candidates. If I turn this down, it's gone forever. Well, then maybe this just wasn't meant to be, Dad said with a shrug that made me want to scream. Everything happens for a reason, and right now, your family needs you. That phrase, your family needs you, had been the soundtrack of my entire life. My family needed me to babysit my cousins during family gatherings while Nathaniel played with his friends. My family needed me to take care of Grandma Evelyn when she had surgery while Nathaniel was away at basketball camp. My family needed me to handle household responsibilities while Nathaniel focused on his studies. But when I needed my family, when I needed their support, their encouragement, their investment in my future, they were always too busy managing Nathaniel's needs to notice mine. I sat in that living room, looking at my parents' expectant faces, and something fundamental shifted inside me. For 18 years, I had accepted their version of reality, that Nathaniel's future was more important than mine, that his needs took precedence over my opportunities, that my role was to sacrifice my dreams to support his. But in that moment, I finally saw the situation clearly. This wasn't about family loyalty or financial necessity. This was about a family that had invested everything in one child and expected the other child to subsidize that investment indefinitely. They weren't asking me to postpone my mentorship because the family was truly in crisis. They were asking me to postpone it because they had made poor financial decisions and expected me to absorb the consequences. They had enabled Nathaniel's irresponsible spending, failed to teach him financial accountability, and now wanted me to work minimum wage jobs to clean up his mess while he enjoyed his Harvard experience debt-free. No, I said quietly. My parents looked confused. What? No, I repeated louder this time. I'm not giving up Margaret Thornfield's mentorship to pay for Nathaniel's credit card debt. Dad's expression hardened. Scarlett, this isn't a negotiation. We're telling you what needs to happen. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, but my voice steady. You're right, Dad. This isn't a negotiation. I'm 18 years old and I'm making my own decisions now. I'm taking the mentorship. I'm going to Chicago. And I'm not contributing a single penny to bail out my brother from consequences he created for himself. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stared at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. You're being selfish, Mom whispered, tears streaming down her face. This is your family. You're right, I said, walking toward the living room door. This is my family. A family that has spent 18 years making it clear that my achievements don't matter, my opportunities aren't worth protecting, and my future is less important than my brother's comfort. Well, I'm done accepting that. I turned back to look at them one more time. If you want to enable Nathaniel's irresponsible behavior, that's your choice. But you're not going to sacrifice my future to do it. As I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, I heard Dad call after me. If you make this choice, don't expect us to support you when things get difficult. I paused on the staircase and turned around. I've never expected your support, Dad. I learned a long time ago that I'm on my own. That night, I called Margaret Thornfield and accepted her mentorship program unconditionally. I also opened my own bank account and moved the $5,000 scholarship money from my regional economics competition win, money my parents had never bothered to ask about or try to control. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based on what was best for my future, not what was most convenient for my family. And terrifying as it was, it felt like finally coming alive. The day I stepped off the Greyhound bus at Chicago Union Station, carrying everything I owned in 2 suitcases and a backpack, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different universe. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with glass towers that seemed to scrape the clouds, and people who moved with a purpose and confidence I'd never seen in Millbrook. I had exactly $847 in my checking account, a reservation at the YWCA hostel for 1 week, and the address of Margaret Thornfield's office building written on a crumpled piece of paper in my pocket. I had never been more terrified or more determined in my entire life. Margaret's office was on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, a gleaming steel and glass monument to success that made every building in my hometown look like a children's toy. When the elevator doors opened onto the reception area of Thornfield Consulting Group, I almost turned around and walked back out. The space was all clean lines and modern art, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. Women in perfectly tailored suits moved through the office with an air of authority that was both intimidating and inspiring. This was a world where female power wasn't questioned or diminished. It was celebrated and leveraged. The receptionist, a poised woman in her 30s with kind eyes, smiled when she saw me. "You must be Scarlett Ravencroft. Ms. Thornfield is expecting you. She's finishing up a conference call, but she asked me to give you this." She handed me an envelope with my name written in elegant script. Inside was a handwritten note that would change my entire perspective on what was possible for my life. "Scarlett," it read, "I've been looking forward to meeting you since I read your business plan. In 30 years of entrepreneurship, I've rarely seen such innovative thinking combined with practical execution from someone so young. You're about to discover that the skills and resilience you've developed fighting for recognition in an environment that undervalued you are actually your greatest assets. The business world rewards people who can create value independently, who don't need constant validation to perform at the highest level, and who understand how to turn obstacles into opportunities. You already possess all of these qualities. Now we're going to teach you how to use them strategically. Welcome to your future. Margaret." I read the note 3 times, my hands shaking slightly. No one in my life had ever spoken to me like this, with such confidence in my abilities, such clear recognition of my potential. It was like being seen for the first time. When Margaret's office door opened, I looked up to see a woman who commanded attention simply by existing. She was probably in her early 50s, with silver hair styled in a sharp bob, wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my family spent on groceries in 6 months. But what struck me most was her eyes. Intelligent, warm, and completely focused on me as if I was the most important person in the world. "Scarlett," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip. "I'm Margaret. I'm so glad you decided to join us this summer." As we walked into her corner office, I was struck by the walls lined with awards, photos with world leaders, and framed articles from major business publications. This was someone who had built an empire from nothing, who had fought her way to the top of an industry that was still largely dominated by men. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "Tell me about your family's reaction to your decision to come here." The directness of the question caught me off guard. I had expected to discuss business plans or internship, responsibilities, not my personal life. They weren't supportive, I said carefully, not sure how much to reveal. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Let me guess. They thought this opportunity was unrealistic for someone in your position. They suggested you should be more practical about your future. They made you feel selfish for pursuing something that might benefit you instead of sacrificing for someone else's dreams." I stared at her, amazed by how accurately she had described my situation. "How did you know?" She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Because I've been exactly where you are. When I was your age, my family had very clear ideas about what was appropriate for young women from our social class. Marriage, children, maybe a nice little teaching job until I found the right husband. When I told them I wanted to start my own business, they acted like I had announced plans to join the circus. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city sprawling below us. My father actually said to me, "Margaret, women who are too ambitious end up alone and unhappy. Don't you want to be loved?" As if ambition and love were mutually exclusive. As if wanting to build something meaningful with my life made me somehow defective as a woman. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. "What did you do?" "I ignored them," she said simply, turning back to face me. And it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But here's what I learned. Families that truly love you will eventually come to respect your choices, even if they don't understand them initially. And families that can't support your success were never really supporting you at all. They were supporting their idea of who you should be. She walked back to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been researching your background. Scarlett, your academic achievements, your competition wins, your business plan. Do you know what impressed me most?" I shook my head. "The fact that you accomplished all of this without significant family support or financial investment. Most of the young people I've mentored over the years had parents who paid for expensive prep courses, private tutors, elite summer programs. They had every advantage money could buy, and they still didn't produce work as innovative as yours." She opened the folder and showed me pages of notes she'd taken about my accomplishments. "You won a regional economics competition while working part-time. You led your school to a state academic decathlon victory while managing household responsibilities that should have been shared by other family members. You created a business plan that addresses real market gaps while being actively discouraged from thinking too big about your future." Margaret leaned forward, her expression intense. "Do you understand what that tells me about your potential? You've been operating at this level while fighting headwinds that would have stopped most people completely. Imagine what you'll accomplish when you have support instead of obstacles, resources instead of limitations, mentorship instead of discouragement." For the first time in my life, someone was treating my achievements not as lucky accidents or consolation prizes, but as evidence of exceptional capability. Someone was looking at the same facts my family had access to and drawing completely different conclusions about my worth and potential. "I want to show you something," Margaret said, opening her laptop and turning the screen toward me. "This is a list of the 12 young people I've mentored over the past 15 years. The names on the screen were followed by impressive titles: CEO of Thornton Industries, founder of Apex Capital Management, Senior Vice President at Goldman Sachs, Director of Strategic Development at Microsoft. Every single one of these people started where you are right now," she continued. "Brilliant, hardworking, underestimated by the people who should have been their biggest champions. What they all learned during their time with me wasn't just business strategy or networking skills. They learned to see themselves the way I see them, as future leaders who deserve every opportunity they can create for themselves." She closed the laptop and looked at me directly. "Your family's inability to recognize your potential isn't a reflection of your worth, Scarlett. It's a reflection of their limitations. And now that you're here, away from those limitations, we're going to find out exactly how extraordinary you can become." That conversation lasted 2 hours, and it fundamentally rewired my understanding of myself and my place in the world. For 18 years, I had internalized my family's message that I was the supporting character in other people's stories. But Margaret saw me as the protagonist of my own epic tale. Over the next week, as I settled into life in Chicago, Margaret introduced me to her world with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a treasured secret. She took me to business dinners where I met women who ran multinational corporations, investors who managed billion-dollar portfolios, entrepreneurs who had built empires from innovative ideas. Every introduction was the same. "This is Scarlett Ravencroft, one of the most promising young business minds I've encountered. Keep an eye on her. She's going to be running companies before she's 30. The confidence in her voice when she spoke about my future was intoxicating. These weren't empty platitudes or polite encouragement. Margaret was a woman who had built her reputation on identifying and developing exceptional talent. When she vouched for someone, people listened. But the most transformative moment came during my second week, when I finally worked up the courage to ask Margaret the question that had been haunting me since I arrived. How do you know I won't disappoint you? How do you know I'm actually as capable as you think I am? She looked at me with the patient expression of someone who had answered this question many times before. Scarlett, disappointment comes from unmet expectations. But I'm not expecting you to be perfect. I'm expecting you to be exactly what you've already proven yourself to be. Someone who finds a way to excel regardless of circumstances. Someone who creates opportunities when none exist. Someone who refuses to accept other people's limitations as her own reality. She paused, then smiled. The question isn't whether you'll meet my expectations. The question is whether you're ready to stop accepting limitations that were never yours to begin with. That night, I called the YWCA hostel and extended my stay. For the full 3 months, I was done going home to a family that couldn't see my worth. I was finally ready to build a life with people who could. 3 weeks into my mentorship with Margaret, I found myself in the most unexpected place. The genealogy section of the Chicago Public Library, surrounded by dusty records and microfiche machines, diving deep into my family's history. What had started as casual curiosity had evolved into a full-scale investigation that was revealing patterns I never could have imagined. It began during one of my regular coffee meetings with Margaret. We met every Wednesday morning at Café Lumière, a quiet spot near her office where she would review my progress and share insights about navigating the business world. During our third meeting, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. Scarlett, have you ever wondered if the way your family treats you is part of a larger pattern, or if you're an isolated case? I had been mid-sip of my cappuccino when she asked, and I nearly choked. What do you mean? In my experience, Margaret said, stirring her espresso thoughtfully, families that systematically undervalue one child's potential while over-investing in another usually have historical precedent for that behavior. It's rarely a conscious decision by individual parents. It's more often an inherited belief system that gets passed down through generations. She pulled out her phone and showed me an article she'd bookmarked. Last month, I read a fascinating study about family resource allocation patterns across 3 generations. The researchers found that families who favored male children in investment decisions had a documented history of similar choices going back 60 to 80 years. The parents weren't consciously choosing to be unfair. They were unconsciously replicating patterns they'd observed in their own childhoods. The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. I had always assumed that my parents' favoritism toward Nathaniel was just their personal bias, their individual failure to see my worth. But what if it was something deeper? What if this pattern of undervaluing daughters had been repeating itself in my family for decades? That afternoon, I called my Aunt Victoria, my father's younger sister who lived in Portland and had always been the family record keeper. She was the one who maintained our genealogy charts, organized family reunions, and seemed to know every story about every relative going back 4 generations. Aunt Victoria, I said, trying to sound casual, I'm working on a project about family history, and I was wondering if you could tell me about the educational backgrounds of the women in our family. Oh, how interesting, she said, clearly delighted by the request. Let me pull out my files. I have information going back to your great-great-grandmother Constance. What she told me over the next hour was both fascinating and heartbreaking. Great-great-grandmother Constance Ravencroft had been accepted to the Boston Conservatory of Music in 1923, with a full scholarship to study piano performance. She was considered a prodigy by her teachers and had been offered private lessons with one of the most renowned pianists of the era. But her parents decided that her younger brother Frederick needed financial support to attend medical school, so Constance was expected to work as a seamstress to help pay his tuition. She never attended the conservatory. Frederick became a successful doctor, and Constance spent her life giving piano lessons to neighborhood children for 50 cents an hour. My great-grandmother Eleanor had been offered a position as head librarian at the Westbridge Public Library in 1947, a prestigious job that would have made her one of the most influential women in the community. But her parents convinced her to turn down the position because her brother William was struggling to establish his law practice and needed someone to work as his unpaid secretary until he could afford to hire proper staff. Eleanor never worked in a library again. William's law firm eventually became one of the most successful practices in the tri-state area. My grandmother Adelaide had been admitted to Columbia University's journalism program in 1965, with a partial scholarship and the promise of an internship at the New York Times. But her parents decided that her brother Charles needed support to expand his construction business, and they couldn't afford to help both children pursue their dreams. Adelaide was expected to use her college fund to invest in Charles's company instead. She never became a journalist. Charles's construction company grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that's still operating today. The pattern was so consistent, it was almost mathematical. In every generation, when resources were limited and choices had to be made, the family invested in the sons' futures while expecting the daughters to sacrifice their opportunities for the greater good of male relatives. But the pattern went even deeper than educational and career opportunities. Aunt Victoria began sharing stories I'd never heard before. Stories about family dynamics, inheritance decisions, and the subtle ways that female ambition had been systematically discouraged across 4 generations. "You know," Aunt Victoria said, her voice growing thoughtful, "I always wondered about your great-aunt Patricia. She was incredibly gifted at mathematics and engineering, really ahead of her time, but every time she talked about wanting to study engineering, your grandfather would redirect the conversation to her responsibilities at home." "What happened to her?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "She married young, had 4 children, and spent her life managing your great-uncle's accounting books for his hardware store. Brilliant woman. Absolutely brilliant. But she never got to use that brilliance for herself." As Aunt Victoria continued sharing family stories, I began taking detailed notes. What emerged was a clear documentation of how intelligent, capable women had been systematically redirected away from their ambitions and toward supporting roles that benefited male family members. The conversation with Aunt Victoria lasted 3 hours, and by the end, I had filled 12 pages with notes about missed opportunities, sacrificed dreams, and squandered potential. But more importantly, I had concrete evidence that what was happening to me wasn't personal. It was generational. That evening, I sat in my small studio apartment near Lincoln Park, surrounded by the notes I'd taken, and began creating what Margaret would later call the pattern map. I drew a family tree, but instead of just names and birth dates, I included the opportunities each person had been offered and the choices that were made. The visual was stunning and heartbreaking. Every single woman in my family for the past 100 years had been offered significant opportunities: scholarships, prestigious positions, business ventures, creative pursuits. And every single one had been convinced to sacrifice those opportunities to support a male relative's ambitions. But as I studied the pattern more closely, I noticed something else. The women who had made these sacrifices weren't passive victims. They were intelligent, capable people who had internalized the belief that their role was to enable other people's success rather than pursue their own. They had been raised to believe that self-sacrifice was not just expected but virtuous. More disturbingly, they had then passed this belief system on to their daughters, creating a cycle where each generation of women was trained to accept limitations and prioritize other people's dreams over their own. The next morning, I called Margaret and asked if we could meet immediately. When I showed her my pattern map and shared what I'd discovered, her expression grew serious. "Scarlett," she said, studying the detailed chart I'd created, "this is remarkable research, and it explains so much about why breaking away from your family's expectations was so difficult. You weren't just rejecting their advice about your summer plans. You were breaking a pattern that had been reinforced for 4 generations." She traced her finger along the family tree, noting each sacrificed opportunity. "Look at the potential that was lost here. Constance could have been a renowned pianist. Eleanor could have revolutionized library sciences. Adelaide could have been an influential journalist. Patricia could have been an engineering pioneer." Margaret looked up at me, her expression intense. "Do you understand what this means? You're not just fighting for your own future, Scarlett. You're fighting to break a generational cycle that has been limiting the women in your family for over a century." The weight of that realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. I wasn't just the daughter who had disappointed her parents by choosing her own path. I was the first woman in 4 generations who had refused to sacrifice her ambitions for someone else's benefit. "But here's what's really important," Margaret continued, pointing to the pattern I'd documented. "Every single woman in your family had exceptional potential. The intelligence, the talent, the opportunity. It was all there. What they lacked wasn't ability. It was permission to prioritize themselves." She leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You just gave yourself that permission. And in doing so, you didn't just change your own trajectory. You broke the cycle for every daughter who comes after you." That afternoon, I sat down and wrote a letter to my cousin Emma, Nathaniel's girlfriend, who was 2 years younger than me and had just been accepted to several prestigious universities. In the letter, I shared everything I'd learned about our family's history and urged her to research her own family's patterns with women and opportunity. 3 weeks later, I received a response that made me cry. Emma had discovered similar patterns in her own family and had decided to accept a full scholarship to study engineering at MIT, a field her parents had initially discouraged as too challenging for someone like her. I realized then that the investigation I'd started out of personal curiosity had become something much larger. It had become a tool for helping other women understand that the limitations they'd accepted as personal failures were actually inherited. Beliefs that could be challenged and changed. The patterns were clear. The evidence was documented. And most importantly, the cycle was finally broken. The revelation about my family's generational patterns had given me clarity, but it also presented me with a choice that would define not just my future, but potentially the future of every woman who came after me in the Ravencroft family line. I could take the traditional path of righteous anger, cut ties completely, build my success in isolation, and prove my worth through distance and achievement. Or I could do something far more strategic and infinitely more challenging. Sitting in Margaret's office on a rainy Thursday afternoon in mid-July when the idea first crystallized. We had been discussing my progress in the mentorship program and my plans for the fall semester at Northwestern University, where I had been accepted into their accelerated business program with a partial scholarship I'd earned independently. "No," Margaret said, reviewing the quarterly reports I'd been preparing for her clients. "Your analytical skills have improved dramatically over the past 6 weeks. But more importantly, your strategic thinking has evolved. You're not just solving problems anymore. You're anticipating them 3 moves ahead." She was right. Working closely with Margaret's consulting firm had taught me to think like a chess master rather than a reactive player. I had learned to identify patterns, predict behavior, and position myself for long-term advantage rather than short-term satisfaction. That's when the strategy began to form in my mind. "Margaret," I said slowly, still working through the implications of what I was considering. "What if I didn't just break the generational pattern in my family? What if I reversed it completely?" She looked up from the reports, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" I stood and walked to the whiteboard in her office, picking up a marker. Every woman in my family for 4 generations has been expected to sacrifice her opportunities to support male relatives' ambitions. The pattern has been, woman achieves something significant, family redirects her toward supporting a man's dreams, woman complies and never reaches her potential. I drew a simple diagram showing the cycle I'd discovered. But what if, instead of just breaking the cycle by achieving success despite my family's lack of support, I created a situation where they would eventually need my success? Where the very brother they've been investing in would have to come to me for help? Margaret's eyes widened as she began to understand what I was proposing. You want to become so successful that Nathaniel's Harvard education becomes irrelevant compared to what you've built. Not just irrelevant, I said, the strategy becoming clearer as I spoke. I want to become the solution to problems they don't even know they're going to have yet. I began outlining my thinking on the whiteboard. Nathaniel is graduating from Harvard with a business degree, but he's never actually built anything. He's never had to work for financial survival, never had to prove himself without family connections, never had to recover from failure. His entire success has been handed to him through parental investment and networking. Margaret nodded, following my logic. So he's educated but not resilient, credentialed but not proven. Exactly. And here's what I've learned from researching our family finances. Dad's law firm is doing well now, but the legal industry is changing rapidly. Artificial intelligence is automating a lot of traditional legal work. Smaller firms are struggling to compete with larger corporate practices, and Dad's client base is aging out. His business model is going to face serious challenges in the next 5 to 10 years. I drew another diagram showing the trajectory I was predicting for my father's firm. Meanwhile, Nathaniel is going to graduate with an expensive education, but no practical business experience. He'll expect to step into a management role at Dad's firm or have them finance whatever venture he decides to pursue. But what if, by the time he graduates, I've built something so successful that I become the family's best financial resource? Margaret leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. You're not planning to get revenge, Scarlett. You're planning to become indispensable. More than that, I said, feeling the excitement of the strategy building. I'm planning to become the first woman in 4 generations of Ravencrofts who has the power to choose whether or not to support a male relative's dreams. And when that moment comes, I'll have the leverage to rewrite the entire family dynamic. The plan I was developing wasn't about anger or spite. It was about strategic positioning and long-term power redistribution. Instead of simply succeeding despite my family's lack of support, I would succeed to such a degree that they would need to acknowledge not just my achievements, but my value as a financial and strategic resource. Margaret and I spent the next 3 hours working through the practical implications of this strategy. It would require several years of aggressive career building, strategic networking, and careful financial management. But more importantly, it would require me to maintain some level of connection with my family rather than cutting ties completely. The most challenging part, Margaret pointed out, will be managing your own emotional well-being while you execute this plan. You'll have to watch them continue to invest in Nathaniel, continue to dismiss your achievements, and continue to treat you as the backup plan. Can you handle that psychological pressure for the 3 to 5 years it will take to reach the position you're describing? I considered her question carefully. The old Scarlett, the one who had been desperate for her family's approval and validation, might not have been able to withstand that kind of emotional strain. But the woman I was becoming, armed with Margaret's mentorship and a clear understanding of the generational patterns I was breaking, felt capable of playing a much longer game. I think I can, I said finally, because I'll know something they don't know. I'll know that every dismissal, every time they choose to invest in Nathaniel instead of acknowledging my success, is actually positioning me for greater leverage in the future. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that separates successful entrepreneurs from people who just work hard. You're not just planning to succeed, you're planning to succeed in a way that forces a complete reorganization of power within your family system. We began sketching out the specific steps this strategy would require. First, I would need to excel academically at Northwestern while building a portfolio of real business achievements. Margaret agreed to continue mentoring me throughout college and to provide introductions to potential investors and partners. Second, I would need to start building wealth and business equity immediately, rather than waiting until after graduation. Margaret offered to help me identify consulting opportunities and small business ventures that could generate income while I was still in school. Third, I would need to maintain strategic communication with my family without revealing the extent of my success until the timing was optimal. This would require careful management of information and expectations. The key, Margaret explained, is that when the moment comes, when Nathaniel needs help or when your parents face financial challenges, you want to be in a position where you're not just able to help, but where your help comes with the power to set new terms for how the family operates. What kind of terms? I asked. Equal recognition, equal respect, equal voice in family decisions, and most importantly, equal investment in future generations of daughters. Margaret's expression grew serious, because if you execute this strategy successfully, you won't just be changing your own position in the family hierarchy. You'll be ensuring that your future daughters, nieces, and female cousins never have to fight the battles you fought. That evening, I called my parents for the first time since leaving for Chicago. The conversation was awkward and strained, but I managed to strike the right tone of dutiful daughter who was learning to be more realistic about her future. I've been thinking about what you said before I left, I told them, carefully modulating my voice to sound slightly subdued, about being more practical and focusing on family responsibilities. I'm learning a lot about business here, and I think it's helping me understand what's really important. I could hear the relief in my mother's voice. Oh, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're gaining some perspective. We were worried that all this business mentorship talk might go to your head. No, I said, fighting to keep the irony out of my voice. I'm definitely learning to keep my feet on the ground. How's Nathaniel doing with his Harvard preparations? For the next 20 minutes, they excitedly updated me on Nathaniel's summer activities, his networking opportunities, and their plans for supporting his transition to college. Not once did they ask about my specific work with Margaret or the skills I was developing. When I hung up the phone, I realized that their dismissal no longer hurt the way it used to. Instead, it felt like valuable intelligence about their mindset and expectations. Every assumption they made about my limitations, every dollar they spent on Nathaniel's future instead of acknowledging my potential, was data I could use to plan my approach. I wasn't the desperate daughter seeking approval anymore. I was a strategist gathering information for a campaign that would ultimately give me the power to rewrite the rules entirely. The game had changed, and for the first time in my life, I was playing to win. The fall semester at Northwestern University became the perfect cover for the most elaborate deception I'd ever orchestrated. To my professors and classmates, I was Scarlett Ravencroft, a driven business student who somehow managed to maintain a 4.0 GPA while running a small consulting practice on the side. To my family, I was their daughter who had finally come to her senses and was pursuing a practical education while learning to be more realistic about her future prospects. The truth was somewhere in between, but far more impressive than either group realized. By October, I had successfully launched Meridian Strategic Consulting, a boutique firm that specialized in helping small and medium-sized businesses optimize their operations and financial structures. The name was deliberately generic, designed to fly under the radar while I built a client base and generated serious revenue. Margaret had introduced me to 3 business owners who were struggling with expansion challenges, and within 6 weeks, I had helped them streamline their processes in ways that increased their profits by an average of 23%. Word spread quickly through Chicago's tight-knit business community, and by November, I had a waiting list of potential clients. The irony was delicious. While my family assumed I was learning basic business principles in college classrooms, was actually solving real-world problems for established companies and earning more money than most of my Northwestern professors. The financial results were staggering. Between my consulting fees and the equity stakes I negotiated with 2 clients, I was generating approximately $8,000 per month in income. For a 19-year-old college student, this was an astronomical amount of money. But more importantly, it was proof that my business instincts were not just academically sound, they were market-tested and profit-generating. The hardest part wasn't managing the workload or balancing my academic responsibilities. The hardest part was maintaining the careful fiction that I was struggling financially and learning to be more practical about my ambitions. During my monthly phone calls home, I had to remember to sound slightly overwhelmed by college expenses, mention concerns about student loan debt, and ask casual questions about potential summer job opportunities in Millbrook. Every conversation required careful script management to maintain their perception that I was finally accepting their version of reality. "How are your classes going, sweetheart?" Mom would ask during our Sunday evening calls. "They're challenging," I would respond, which was technically true. "I'm learning so much about business fundamentals, but it's really making me appreciate how competitive the corporate world is. I'm starting to understand why you and Dad always emphasized being realistic about career expectations." These conversations were performances, carefully designed to reinforce their belief that my summer in Chicago had been educational, but ultimately humbling. They needed to believe that I was slowly abandoning my unrealistic ambitions in favor of more modest goals that would keep me closer to home and more available for family responsibilities. Meanwhile, Margaret was helping me navigate challenges I never could have anticipated. Running a successful consulting practice while maintaining full-time student status required organizational skills that went far beyond anything I'd learned in high school. I had to master client relationship management, project timeline coordination, financial forecasting, and strategic planning, all while ensuring that my academic performance never slipped. "The key," Margaret explained during one of our weekly strategy sessions, "is systems thinking. You can't just work harder, you have to work more efficiently. Every process in your business needs to be streamlined and scalable." She taught me to use project management software, helped me develop client onboarding protocols, and introduced me to accounting systems that would allow me to track profitability with precision. More importantly, she helped me understand how to position myself as an expert rather than just a service provider. "Clients don't just want someone to solve their problems," she said. "They want someone who can anticipate problems they don't even know they have yet. That's where the real value creation happens, and that's where you can command premium pricing." By December, I had developed such a reputation for strategic insight that business owners were referring me to their colleagues without any solicitation on my part. I had accidentally created what Margaret called organic growth through value. Delivery, the kind of business development that money can't buy. But the most satisfying part of this period wasn't the financial success or the professional recognition. It was watching my family's reaction to updates about Nathaniel's Harvard experience and knowing that I was quietly building something far more substantial than anything he was learning in his prestigious classrooms. During Christmas break, the contrast between our actual achievements and our family's perceptions of our achievements became almost comical. Nathaniel came home full of stories about his economics courses, his networking events, and his plans for summer internships at investment firms that Dad's connections had arranged for him. Our parents hung on every word, asking detailed questions about his professors, his social experiences, and his long-term career prospects. The excitement in their voices when discussing his future was palpable. When they asked about my fall semester, I carefully shared stories about my business classes, mentioned that I was doing well academically, and expressed gratitude for the practical education I was receiving. I talked about learning to manage budgets, understanding market dynamics, and gaining appreciation for the challenges of running successful enterprises. "It sounds like you're really maturing in your thinking," Dad said approvingly. "College is supposed to teach you about the real world, not just theory." If only he knew that while he was speaking, I had 3 client payments pending in my business, a count that would total more than he earned in a typical month at his law firm. The Christmas dinner conversation that year was particularly illuminating. Uncle Marcus asked Nathaniel about his academic focus, and my brother launched into an impressive presentation about international trade theory and macroeconomic policy frameworks. "That's the kind of big-picture thinking that will serve you well in corporate leadership," Uncle Marcus said, nodding approvingly. When the conversation turned to me, I shared a deliberately modest story about helping a local nonprofit organization streamline their volunteer coordination system, which was technically true since I had done pro bono consulting work for a Chicago charity. I described it as a class project rather than professional consulting, and emphasized how much the experience had taught me about the importance of realistic expectations and sustainable growth. Everyone nodded approvingly at my newfound maturity and practical focus. Nobody asked about the financial details of the project or whether it had led to other opportunities. They simply accepted the narrative that I was finally learning to think small and be satisfied with modest achievements. The irony was that the modest, nonprofit project I described had actually led to 3 paid consulting contracts with other organizations, generating $15,000 in revenue and establishing my reputation in the nonprofit sector as someone who could deliver transformational results efficiently and affordably. But perhaps the most revealing moment came when Aunt Victoria asked about our post-graduation plans. Nathaniel immediately began discussing his strategy for leveraging his Harvard network, his applications for prestigious MBA programs, and his timeline for establishing himself in investment banking or corporate consulting. When she asked about my plans, I talked about potentially working for a small business in Millbrook, maybe eventually helping Dad with some administrative aspects of his law firm, and finding ways to use my business education to support local economic development. "That sounds wonderfully grounded," Aunt Victoria said warmly. "It's so refreshing to see a young woman who understands the value of community and family over ambition." As I sat at that Christmas dinner table, listening to my family praise my newfound maturity while simultaneously celebrating Nathaniel's ambitious plans, I realized that the deception had become more than just a strategic necessity. It had become a fascinating social experiment in how families create and maintain narratives about their members' potential. They needed to believe that I had abandoned my unrealistic dreams because it validated their decision to invest exclusively in Nathaniel's future. They needed to believe that I was finally accepting a supporting role because it confirmed their assumptions about appropriate gender dynamics and family hierarchy. But what they couldn't see was that every month I spent building Meridian Strategic Consulting. I was gaining skills, connections, and financial resources that would eventually make me the most powerful member of our family. And when that moment came, when they needed help rather than offering it, I would be in a position to rewrite every assumption they had ever made about my worth and potential. The deception was working perfectly, but more importantly, the strategy behind it was exceeding every projection I had made. By the spring of my sophomore year, the disconnect between my family's perception of my life and my actual achievements had become so vast that I sometimes felt like I was living in parallel universes. While they believed I was struggling with typical college challenges and gradually accepting more modest career aspirations, I was actually building a business empire that was attracting attention from some of Chicago's most successful entrepreneurs. The transformation of Meridian Strategic Consulting from a small side business to a legitimate consulting firm happened faster than even Margaret had predicted. What started as helping 3 small businesses optimize their operations had evolved into a comprehensive strategic advisory service with 12 regular clients and a waiting list of potential customers who had heard about my results through word-of-mouth referrals. The financial numbers told the story most clearly. By March, I was generating $18,000 per month in consulting revenue, plus equity stakes in 4 different companies that were implementing my strategic recommendations. My personal savings account had grown to $127,000, and I had established a separate business investment account with another $89,000 that I was using to take strategic positions in promising startups. But the money, impressive as it was for a 19-year-old college student, wasn't the most significant indicator of what I was building. The real measure of my success was the caliber of people who were seeking my advice and the complexity of problems they were bringing to me. Dr. Amanda Chen, who owned a chain of 3 medical practices in the Chicago suburbs, had hired me to develop a growth strategy for expanding into telehealth services. The project required me to analyze healthcare regulations, insurance reimbursement models, technology infrastructure requirements, and competitive positioning strategies. When I delivered my recommendations, she implemented them exactly as I had outlined, and her practices saw a 67% increase in patient capacity within 6 months. Marcus Rodriguez, the founder of a sustainable packaging company, brought me in to help him navigate a critical expansion decision. His company had developed an innovative biodegradable packaging material, but he was struggling to scale production while maintaining quality standards and managing cash flow. I helped him restructure his operations, negotiate better supplier agreements, and develop a partnership strategy with 3 major retailers. The result was a $2.3 million increase in annual revenue and a business model that was sustainable and scalable. Sarah Thompson, who had inherited her family's century-old manufacturing business, was facing the challenge of modernizing operations without losing the company's competitive advantages. I spent 3 months analyzing her supply chains, production processes, and market positioning, then developed a digital transformation strategy that preserved her artisan quality standards while increasing efficiency by 45%. The project was so successful that she recommended me to the Chicago Small Business Development Council as a strategic advisor. Each of these projects required skills that most MBA students wouldn't develop until years into their careers. I was conducting market research, financial modeling, strategic planning, and implementation management at a level that impressed seasoned business professionals. More importantly, I was delivering measurable results that were transforming my clients' companies and their lives. The most challenging part of this period wasn't managing the complexity of multiple high-stakes consulting projects while maintaining a perfect GPA at Northwestern. The most challenging part was concealing the magnitude of what I was accomplishing from everyone except Margaret. During my regular family phone calls, I had perfected the art of discussing my business classes and group projects in ways that gave them glimpses of my actual work without revealing its true scope. When my mother asked about my coursework, I would mention learning about small business challenges and strategic planning concepts. When my father inquired about my summer plans, I would talk about potentially doing some part-time work to help local businesses. Technically, everything I told them was true. I was learning about small business challenges, by solving them, for paying clients. I was studying strategic planning concepts, by developing and implementing strategies that were generating millions of dollars in value for established companies. I was planning to help local businesses, except that my local market had expanded to include the entire Midwest region, and my part-time work was actually a full-scale consulting practice that was being courted by venture capital firms. The spring semester brought an opportunity that would have been impossible to explain to my family, so I simply never mentioned it. Margaret introduced me to Elena Volkov, a former Goldman Sachs executive who was launching a private equity fund focused on investing in women-owned businesses. Elena had heard about my work through her network and wanted to discuss the possibility of my joining her fund as a junior partner while finishing my undergraduate degree. "Scarlett," Elena said during our first meeting at her downtown office, I've been tracking your consulting work for the past 6 months. The value creation you're generating for your clients is extraordinary. But what's even more impressive is your ability to identify operational inefficiencies that other consultants miss entirely. She pulled out a folder containing detailed analyses of 3 companies I had worked with. Dr. Chen's telehealth expansion generated 67% capacity growth. Marcus Rodriguez's sustainable packaging company increased revenue by $2.3 million. Sarah. Thompson's manufacturing transformation improved efficiency by 45%. These aren't typical consulting outcomes, Scarlett. These are transformational results. Elena's proposal was stunning. She wanted to offer me a 15% equity stake in her new fund, plus a $150,000 annual salary, in exchange for my commitment to identify and analyze potential investment opportunities while continuing my undergraduate studies. The position would give me access to deal flow worth hundreds of millions of dollars and mentorship from some of the most successful investors in the private equity industry. After discussing the opportunity with Margaret, I accepted Elena's offer, with one condition: absolute confidentiality about my involvement until after my college graduation. I couldn't risk my family discovering that their practical daughter was now a junior partner in a private equity fund, while still maintaining the fiction that I was learning to be more realistic about my career prospects. By May, I was simultaneously managing my consulting practice, maintaining a 4.0 GPA at Northwestern, and conducting due diligence on potential investments for Elena's fund. My typical week included client strategy sessions, academic coursework, financial modeling for potential acquisitions, and carefully scripted phone calls home where I discussed my excitement about learning practical business skills and my appreciation for my family's guidance about staying grounded. The contradiction between my actual life and my family's perception of it had become so extreme that I sometimes wondered if I was developing multiple personality disorder. During family conversations, I was the dutiful daughter who was grateful for her parents' wisdom about accepting limitations and focusing on realistic goals. During business meetings, I was a strategic advisor whose insights were reshaping companies and generating substantial wealth for multiple stakeholders. The emotional complexity of maintaining this dual existence was exhausting, but it was also incredibly empowering. Every month that passed, every successful project I completed, every dollar I earned and invested was building toward the moment when I would have enough leverage to rewrite the entire dynamic of my family relationships. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of this period was watching the news about Nathaniel's Harvard experience and knowing that despite all the money and connections being invested in his education, he was developing none of the practical skills that were making me genuinely successful. During his spring break visit home, Nathaniel regaled the family with stories about his internship applications, his networking events, and his theoretical coursework in international economics. He had impressive credentials and valuable connections, but when Dad asked him specific questions about business strategy or problem-solving approaches, his answers were purely academic. Meanwhile, I was sitting at the same dinner table, nodding politely while knowing that the previous week I had solved a supply chain crisis for a $50 million manufacturing company and negotiated a partnership deal that would generate $8 million in new revenue over 3 years. The gap between Nathaniel's theoretical knowledge and my practical expertise was widening every month, but my family remained completely unaware of this shift. They were still operating under the assumption that his Harvard credentials would automatically translate into professional success, while my practical education was preparing me for more modest achievements. What they couldn't see was that I was already achieving more in real business terms than most Harvard MBAs would accomplish in their first decade of corporate careers. The stage was being set for a revelation that would fundamentally challenge every assumption they had ever made about merit, investment, and potential. The hardest part wasn't building the empire. It was keeping it secret while watching them continue to invest in a future that was already obsolete. The moment I had been strategically positioning myself for arrived on a humid Tuesday afternoon in late June, exactly 3 years after I had walked away from my family's emergency meeting about Nathaniel's Harvard expenses. I was in my downtown Chicago office. Yes, I now had an actual office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Grant Park, when my phone rang with a call that would change everything. It was my father, and for the first time in my memory, Richard Ravencroft sounded genuinely panicked. "Scarlett, honey, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said, his voice strained in a way I'd never heard before. "Do you know anything about business consulting or financial restructuring?" I almost laughed at the irony. After 3 years of carefully concealing the fact that I was now one of the most sought-after strategic consultants in the Midwest, my father was calling to ask if I knew anything about the very expertise I'd been building. "Why do you ask, Dad?" I said, keeping my voice neutral while my assistant, Rebecca, silently placed a stack of contracts on my desk from 3 Fortune 500 companies seeking my advisory services. "We're in trouble, Scarlett. Real trouble." The admission seemed to physically pain him. "The law firm is facing some serious challenges. 2 of our biggest corporate clients have been acquired by larger companies that use different legal firms. The Meridian Industries lawsuit that we've been working on for 18 months just settled for much less than we projected, which means our contingency fee is a fraction of what we had budgeted. And the new legal software requirements for federal compliance are going to cost us nearly $200,000 to implement." He paused, and I could hear him taking a shaky breath. "We've been operating at a loss for 8 months, and our business loan payments are coming due. The bank is threatening to call in our line of credit, and we need to either restructure our debt or find additional revenue streams within the next 60 days. I sat in my leather chair, looking out at the Chicago skyline where I had built an empire while they assumed I was learning to accept limitations, and felt the sweet satisfaction of a perfectly executed long-term strategy reaching its climax. "That sounds really stressful, Dad," I said carefully. "Have you considered hiring a business consultant to help you analyze your options?" "That's actually why I'm calling," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Your mother remembered that you mentioned learning about small business challenges in your courses. We were wondering if maybe you'd picked up enough knowledge to help us think through some basic options. We can't afford to hire a professional consultant right now, and frankly, we're not sure who to trust with confidential information about the firm's finances." The irony was so perfect, it felt like the universe had scripted it specifically for my entertainment. The family that had refused to invest in my education, that had dismissed my business achievements, that had spent 3 years assuming I was learning to be practical and realistic, was now asking me to solve their financial crisis using skills they didn't even know I possessed. "I'd be happy to take a look at your situation," I said, my voice carefully measured. "But Dad, if the problems are as serious as you're describing, you really need professional help. Maybe I could recommend someone." "We can't afford professional consultants, Scarlett. The hourly rates these business advisory firms charge are astronomical." We got a quote from Meridian Strategic Consulting, supposedly one of the best firms in the region, and they wanted $300 an hour just for an initial assessment. I nearly choked on my coffee. He was complaining about the hourly rate of my own company without having any idea that he was talking to the founder and CEO of the firm he couldn't afford to hire. "Why don't you drive up this weekend?" I suggested, "and I'll take a look at your financial statements. Maybe we can brainstorm some solutions." "You would do that? Even after—" He trailed off, but I knew he was thinking about our argument 3 years ago, when I had chosen Margaret's mentorship over their demand that I sacrifice my future to pay for Nathaniel's credit card debt. "Of course, Dad. You're my family." That Saturday, my parents drove to Chicago for what they believed would be a humble consultation with their daughter who had learned some basic business concepts in college. What they actually walked into was a meeting with one of the most successful strategic consultants in the Midwest, conducted in a professional office suite that radiated success and authority. When they stepped off the elevator on the 38th floor of the Pinnacle Tower, I watched their faces change from confidence to confusion to something approaching shock. The reception area of Meridian Strategic Consulting was designed to impress. Modern furniture, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows with breathtaking city views, and a professional atmosphere that clearly indicated serious business success. "Scarlett?" my mother said uncertainly as Rebecca greeted them professionally and offered coffee from our premium espresso machine. "What is this place?" "This is where I work," I said simply, emerging from my corner office wearing a tailored business suit that probably cost more than they had spent on my entire wardrobe growing up. "Welcome to Meridian Strategic Consulting." The silence that followed was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. I watched my parents process the fact that their daughter, the one they had dismissed as impractical, the one they had expected to sacrifice her opportunities for, Nathaniel's benefit, the one they assumed was learning to accept modest ambitions, was standing in front of them as the owner of a consulting firm they couldn't afford to hire. "I don't understand," my father said slowly, looking around the office space that clearly represented substantial success and investment. "How is this? When did you? This is your company." "I founded Meridian Strategic Consulting during my sophomore year," I said, guiding them into the conference room where I had prepared a presentation that would systematically demolish every assumption they had ever made about my capabilities. "We're now one of the top strategic advisory firms in the region, with clients ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies." I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room's large screen display. "I've prepared an analysis of Ravencroft and Associates' financial situation based on the information Dad shared with me. But before we discuss solutions to your current crisis, I thought you might be interested in learning about what I've been building while you assumed I was just taking business classes." The presentation I had prepared was comprehensive and devastating. I showed them Meridian Strategic Consulting's client portfolio, our annual revenue projections, the equity stakes I held in various companies, and the measurable results we had generated for our clients. I walked them through case studies of companies I had transformed, partnerships I had negotiated, and investment opportunities I had identified and developed. By the time I reached the financial summary slides, my parents were sitting in stunned silence. The company their practical daughter had built was generating more annual revenue than my father's law firm had ever achieved in its best year. The consulting practice they couldn't afford to hire was owned by the young woman they had spent 3 years pitying for her modest ambitions. "This is impossible," my mother whispered, staring at the screen displaying Meridian Strategic Consulting's client testimonials and success metrics. "You're 21 years old. How could you have built all of this? The same way you build anything?" "Substantial," I replied calmly. "Through strategic planning, hard work, and the willingness to invest in long-term success rather than short-term comfort. The same qualities you always said Nathaniel possessed, but apparently never noticed in me." My father was studying the financial projections with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "These numbers, if this is accurate, your company is worth millions of dollars, $8.7 million in current valuation, according to our most recent assessment," I confirmed. "Though Elena Volkov's private equity fund has indicated they would value us significantly higher for acquisition purposes." The mention of Elena's fund, one of the most prestigious investment groups in Chicago, seemed to be the final piece of evidence they needed to accept that their understanding of my life had been completely and systematically wrong for 3 years. "But you said you were learning to be more realistic," my mother said weakly. "You said you understood about being practical and not reaching too high." I smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it was completely genuine and without any strategic calculation behind it. "I said I was learning about the real world, Mom, and I was. I learned that the real world rewards competence, innovation, and results. I learned that the limitations you placed on my ambitions were your limitations, not mine. And I learned that sometimes the best way to prove a point is to prove it so thoroughly that denial becomes impossible. I clicked to the final slide of my presentation, which contained a single sentence in large, bold text. Proposal for Ravencroft and Associates Restructuring. Pro bono services by Meridian Strategic Consulting. Now, I said, sitting back in my chair and looking at my parents with the calm confidence of someone who held all the leverage in the room, let's discuss how to save your law firm. The silence in my conference room stretched for nearly 2 full minutes after I offered to provide pro bono services to save their law firm. I watched my parents' faces cycle through a series of emotions I had never seen them display. Shock, confusion, shame, and something that might have been the early stages of genuine respect. My father was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scarlett, I need you to help me understand something. For 3 years, every time we talked, you sounded like you were struggling to keep up with college coursework and learning to accept more modest career goals. How were you managing all of this while maintaining that fiction?" The word fiction hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about trust, honesty, and the fundamental nature of our family relationships. "It wasn't fiction, Dad," I said carefully. "It was strategy. Every conversation we had was technically truthful. I was learning about small business challenges by solving them for paying clients. I was studying strategic planning concepts by developing and implementing strategies for established companies. I was working to help local businesses. It's just that my definition of local expanded to include the entire Midwest region." My mother was staring at the financial projections still displayed on the conference room screen, her face pale. "But why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us believe that you had given up on your ambitions?" The question I had been preparing to answer for 3 years finally arrived, and I found myself feeling less vindictive and more sad than I had expected. "Because you needed to believe it," I said quietly. "You needed to believe that I had accepted your version of what was appropriate for my life. Because the alternative, that you had been systematically wrong about my potential for 18 years, was too threatening to your worldview." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I had built my empire while they assumed I was learning to be realistic. Every time I achieved something significant growing up, you found ways to minimize it or redirect attention to Nathaniel's accomplishments. The regional economics competition, the state academic decathlon, the Young Entrepreneurs Award, none of those achievements were enough to change how you saw me. Turning back to face them, I continued. So I decided to build something so undeniably successful that you would have to acknowledge my capabilities. But more importantly, I wanted to be in a position where I could choose whether or not to help you, rather than always being expected to sacrifice my opportunities for family needs. My father's expression was shifting from shock to something that looked like dawning comprehension. "The mentorship program. When we asked you to give up Margaret Thornfield's mentorship to help pay for Nathaniel's credit card debt. That's when you decided to build all of this. That's when I realized that no achievement would ever be enough to earn your respect through conventional means," I confirmed. "So I decided to earn your respect through leverage instead." The word leverage seemed to hit them both with physical force. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about my personal success. It was about fundamentally restructuring the power dynamics within our family. "Where's Nathaniel in all of this?" my mother asked suddenly, as if she had just remembered that their golden child existed. "Does he know about your company?" I smiled, and for the first time, there was genuine amusement in it, rather than strategic calculation. "Nathaniel texted me last week asking if I could help him with his resume. He's having trouble finding employment after graduation because, despite his Harvard credentials, he doesn't have any practical business experience. Most of the positions he's applying for want candidates who can demonstrate actual problem-solving abilities and measurable results. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. While they had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in Nathaniel's theoretical education, I had been building practical expertise and generating real value in the marketplace. Now their son with the prestigious degree was struggling to find work, while their daughter with the practical education was successful enough to potentially save their failing business. "He doesn't know about Meridian Strategic," I continued. "Just like you didn't know. I've been very careful about managing information flow to maintain strategic advantages." My father leaned forward, his lawyer instincts engaging despite his emotional shock. "Scarlett, what you've accomplished is extraordinary. But I have to ask, what do you want from us now? This level of strategic deception, this careful positioning for leverage, what's your end game?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved a complete answer. "What I want," I said, returning to my seat at the head of the conference table, "is what I've always wanted. I want to be valued for my actual capabilities, rather than dismissed because of your assumptions about my limitations. I want my achievements to be celebrated rather than minimized. I want my opinions to carry weight in family decisions rather than being discounted because I'm the daughter instead of the son." I pulled up a new presentation slide that showed a family organizational chart. "But more than that, I want to ensure that the generational pattern I documented, where women sacrifice their opportunities to support male relatives, ends with me. I want my future daughters, nieces, and female cousins to grow up in a family that invests equally in their potential." My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the organizational chart. "We didn't realize we were doing that to you. We thought we were protecting you, helping you be realistic about what was possible." "I know you thought that," I said gently. "But impact matters more than intention. And the impact of your choices was that I learned not to trust your judgment about my potential. Everything I've built, I built despite your guidance, not because of it." The room fell silent again as they absorbed the full implications of what I was telling them. Their parenting philosophy, their resource allocation decisions, their fundamental assumptions about their children's capabilities. All of it was being systematically challenged by evidence they couldn't dispute. "What happens now?" my father asked finally. I clicked to my final presentation slide, which outlined a comprehensive restructuring plan for Ravencroft and Associates. "Now I save your law firm," I said simply. "Not because you deserve it, but because I'm capable of it. And because I want to demonstrate what partnership looks like when it's based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical assumptions." The restructuring plan I had prepared was thorough and sophisticated. I had identified 3 new revenue streams that would leverage Dad's existing expertise while expanding into higher-margin services. I had developed a digital transformation strategy that would reduce overhead costs by 35% while improving client service delivery. I had created partnership opportunities with other professional service firms that would generate referral income and expand their market reach. "This plan," I explained, walking them through each component, "will not only solve your immediate financial crisis but position the firm for sustainable growth over the next 5 years. Implementation will require approximately 6 months of intensive work, and I estimate it will increase your annual revenue by 60% within 18 months. My parents studied the plan with growing amazement. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking they had always assumed required expensive consultants and years of business school training. Instead, it was being delivered by their daughter, whom they had spent 3 years pitying for her modest ambitions. "Why are you willing to do this for us?" my mother asked, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything we put you through, after all the ways we failed to see your worth, why would you help us?" I looked at both of my parents, seeing them, clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. They weren't villains who had intentionally tried to limit my potential. They were people who had inherited belief systems about gender, family, and opportunity that they had never examined or questioned. They had made decisions based on unconscious biases that had caused real harm. But they had done so while genuinely believing they were acting in everyone's best interests. Because, I said finally, this isn't about revenge. It's about transformation. I want to show you what's possible when you invest in someone's potential rather than limiting it. I want to demonstrate what partnership looks like when it's based on respect for capabilities rather than assumptions about limitations. I stood and extended my hand to my father. So, Mr. Ravencroft, do you accept Meridian Strategic Consulting's proposal to restructure your firm? He looked at my outstretched hand, then up at my face, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine pride in his eyes. Yes, Ms. Ravencroft, he said, shaking my hand with the firmness of one business professional, acknowledging another. We accept your proposal. That handshake changed everything. In that moment, I wasn't their daughter who needed guidance about being realistic. I was their business partner who held the expertise they needed to survive and thrive. The transformation was complete, and it was irreversible. 18 months after that transformative handshake in my conference room, I'm sitting in the newly renovated offices of Ravencroft and Associates, watching my father present a case strategy to 3 senior partners from Morrison, Caldwell and Associates, the same law firm where I once filed papers for $8 an hour. The irony isn't lost on me, but what strikes me most is how fundamentally everything has changed, not just in terms of business success, but in the entire fabric of how our family operates. The restructuring plan I implemented didn't just save Dad's law firm, it transformed it into one of the most innovative legal practices in the region. The digital transformation strategy I developed allowed them to offer remote services that attracted clients from across 3 states. The partnership agreements I negotiated with accounting firms and business consultants created a comprehensive professional services network that generated $1.2 million in additional revenue last year alone. But the most significant transformation wasn't financial. It was cultural. Last month, my 15-year-old cousin Emma called me for advice about her college applications. She had been accepted into a prestigious summer program for aspiring engineers at Stanford University, but her parents were hesitant about the cost and the distance from home. Instead of automatically accepting their concerns as valid limitations, Emma had remembered our conversation about family patterns and decided to seek a different perspective. Aunt Scarlett, she said during our video call, I know this program could change my life, but my parents keep saying it's too expensive and too risky for someone my age. They think I should focus on more practical options closer to home. Does this sound familiar? It sounded more than familiar. It sounded like a precise replay of conversations I'd had with my own parents 20 years earlier. But this time, there was a crucial difference. This time, there was someone in the family with the resources and influence to ensure that Emma's potential wouldn't be sacrificed to inherited limitations. Emma, I told her, I'm going to pay for your Stanford program, and I'm going to have a conversation with your parents about investment versus limitation. But more importantly, I want you to understand something. The fact that you recognized this pattern and reached out for help means you're already breaking a cycle that has been limiting women in our family for generations. That conversation led to a broader family discussion about how we approach young people's opportunities. For the first time in our family's documented history, we established a formal education fund specifically dedicated to supporting ambitious projects and unconventional opportunities for all family members, regardless of gender. I contributed the initial $500,000 to the fund, but the real victory was watching other family members, including my parents, add their own contributions and commit to evaluating opportunities based on potential rather than gender-based assumptions. The ripple effects have been extraordinary. Emma is now thriving in her engineering program and has already been offered internships at 2 major technology companies. My cousin Marcus, Nathaniel's younger brother, decided to pursue a career in sustainable architecture, instead of following the traditional business path our family had always encouraged for male relatives. Most surprisingly, Aunt Victoria started her own genealogy consulting business at age 57, finally using the research skills she had been developing as a hobby for 30 years. But perhaps the most profound change has been in Nathaniel himself. After struggling to find employment for 8 months following his Harvard graduation, he finally swallowed his pride and asked me for advice. The conversation we had was unlike any we'd shared in our entire lives. "Scarlett," he said, sitting across from me in the coffee shop where I'd first met with Margaret Thornfield all those years ago. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you think I'm incompetent?" The question surprised me with its directness and vulnerability. The old Nathaniel, the one who had grown up believing he was naturally destined for success, would never have asked such a thing. "No, Nathaniel," I said honestly. "I think you're intelligent and capable, but I think you've never been required to prove your capabilities under pressure, and that's left you unprepared for a competitive job market that values results over credentials." What followed was a 3-hour conversation about privilege, potential, and the difference between being given opportunities and earning them. By the end of our talk, Nathaniel had asked me to mentor him in developing practical business skills, and I had agreed, with conditions. "I'll help you," I told him. "But you have to start from the bottom. No family connections, no leveraging. Dad's network, no shortcuts. You're going to learn the same way I did, by working harder than everyone else and proving your value through results." Nathaniel agreed, and for the past year he's been working as a junior analyst at one of Meridian Strategic's partner firms. He's earning $45,000 a year, less than I made in a typical month when I was his age. But he's learning skills that his Harvard education never taught him. More importantly, he's developing the resilience and work ethic that privilege had prevented him from building. The transformation in our family dynamics has been so complete that sometimes I marvel at how different our conversations are now. During our monthly family dinners, my achievements are discussed with the same enthusiasm that once was reserved exclusively for Nathaniel's activities. My business insights are sought and valued. My opinions carry weight in family decisions. But the real measure of success isn't how my family treats me now. It's how they treat opportunities and potential in general. Last week, my 12-year-old niece, Sophia, announced that she wants to become a marine biologist and study ocean conservation. Instead of the gentle discouragement that might have greeted such an ambitious announcement in the past, the entire family began discussing how to support her interest. Dad immediately offered to research marine biology programs. Mom started looking into summer camps focused on marine science. Uncle Marcus mentioned his friend who works for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The generational pattern that had limited women in our family for over a century has been completely broken, replaced by a culture that invests in potential regardless of gender. The success of Meridian Strategic Consulting has continued to exceed every projection I made during those early strategic planning sessions with Margaret. We now manage over $50 million in client assets, employ 37 people, and have expanded into 3 additional cities. Elena Volkov's private equity fund eventually acquired a 40% stake in the company for $15 million, making me one of the youngest female entrepreneurs to achieve 8-figure liquidity in the Midwest. But the financial success, as satisfying as it is, isn't what I'm most proud of. What I'm most proud of is the email I received last month from a young woman named Ashley Martinez, who had read about my story in a business magazine article. "Ms. Ravencroft," she wrote, "I'm 19 years old, and my family has been pressuring me to give up my scholarship to study computer science so I can help support my brother's law school education. They say that as the daughter, I should be more focused on family responsibilities than personal ambitions. Reading about your experience gave me the courage to say no. I'm keeping my scholarship, and I'm going to build something that proves they were wrong about my potential. Thank you for showing me that breaking family patterns isn't selfish. It's necessary. That email reminded me that the strategy I developed wasn't just about changing my own circumstances. It was about demonstrating that the limitations families place on their daughters aren't unchangeable facts. They're inherited beliefs that can be challenged and transformed. Looking back on the journey from that devastating phone call about Nathaniel's Harvard expenses to the thriving business empire I've built, I realized that my family's initial dismissal of my potential was actually a gift. It forced me to develop independence, resilience, and strategic thinking skills that I never would have acquired if success had been handed to me. The young woman who once worked 3 jobs to afford community college textbooks while her brother's Harvard education was fully funded has become someone who can write checks to fund other people's dreams. The daughter who was expected to sacrifice her mentorship opportunity to pay for someone else's credit card debt is now in a position to ensure that no other woman in her family will ever face that choice. But most importantly, the girl who spent 18 years fighting for recognition in a family that didn't see her worth has become a woman who no longer needs anyone's validation to know her value. Sometimes the people who love us most can be the biggest obstacles to our growth, not because they want to limit us, but because their vision of what's possible for our lives is smaller than what we're actually capable of achieving. When that happens, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue or fight or demand they see your worth. The most powerful thing you can do is to build something so undeniably successful that denial becomes impossible and leverage becomes love. Because when you stop seeking approval from people who don't understand your vision and start creating value for people who do, you don't just change your own life. You change the trajectory of everyone who comes after you, and that, more than any business success or financial achievement, is a legacy worth building. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the E, mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.